All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this episode. Ito na, medyo we mean business. Okay, we mean this. This episode is about a grand strategy for a middle power, right? And we are talking about, of course, the Philippines, right? Which for a very long time has been the misnomer has been a small power. I think that's factually problematic and in many ways insulting, or at least confining in terms of ambition. So let's talk about the Philippines. So, let's start with you, Miko. Is the Philippines, in your opinion, already a middle power? I mean, at least in terms of like 30 biggest economies, 15 biggest population, some modernization that is happening, the armed forces, almost an upper middle income country. If India can be talked about as a superpower already, despite their very low per capita of barely $3,000, then maybe our $4,000 per capita should not prevent us from going there. I mean, what is your reading on that? What makes us a potential middle power or already an emergent middle power?
Yeah, I think we are an emerging middle power, but not quite there yet. Yung, we are on our way there. Definitely.
You want to speak louder? Sorry, Miko. Medyo mahina pa
Sorry.
yung boses mo. Yeah. Yes, please speak louder.
Coming in clear?
Yes, much better now. Yeah.
Okay.
Or you want to take out
I
your
think-
earphones? Baka mas malakas pa. Hindi naman.
Hindi, mas maano eh.
Baka maingay. Now better. Okay, yeah. Please,
Yeah,
just a little bit louder. Thank you.
Yeah, as I mentioned a while ago, we are on our way there. We are an emergent or emerging middle power, but not quite there yet. Not yet, definitely not yet in the tier of South Korea, Japan, and so on, or Australia even. I think, yun nga, even in yung sa metrics ng Lowy Institute, if I'm not mistaken, we are classified as a middle power. We are on the lower end of that ranking. No? So maybe I'll stop there. Now we are emerging, but not there yet.
Okay, we're a nudge lower perhaps. Ikaw, Josh, do you think we're at the cusp or we have already crossed the threshold? It's just that we have to recognize it.
I've had many conversations about this, and ang nangyayari kasi dito sa kanila, ang tingin ng iba dito is that, oh Josh, you're just doing a half full, half empty na argument dito. No? Pero ang argument ko dito kasi, if you look at the threshold, we are a low tier middle power. Yun lang, if we're gonna have to nuance it, we're a low tier middle power. We have to put that into context. Hindi naman tayo dapat mag-asta na parang Japan, South Korea, because we're not. Okay?
We're not a full-fledged. We're not a full-fledged.
Hindi pa tayo full-fledged.
Diba? We're a small middle power. Like parang
kasi if I want to, so Justin can pitch in on this one and also Miko. Kasi when you look at the military power, of course, ang titignan natin dito, we don't have these capabilities militarily. Pero kung titignan mo yung granularity or ng defense ng military power natin, ang pinakamataas natin doon is combat experience. Hindi natin pinag-uusapan yun. I would say, ang problema kasi ng IR na literature is that we focus so much on the material, but hindi natin ini-include yung non-material. Stephen Biddle in his 2006 book, Military Power, mentioned that as his core argument. When you talk about military power, you also have to take into account yung mga non-quantitative measurements such as doctrine, force employment.
Sorry for cutting you there, Josh. I think that's why some are saying Ukraine now probably has one of the most powerful land forces in the world. Because they're the most combat-ready, Western-oriented military, right?
I don't know whether Justin and Miko have their own take on that one. Pero if you look at military power, wag naman sana tayong tumingin lamang doon sa usual, no? At the surface. Of course, kulang tayo. Dapat natin tandaan yan. Pero look, we have to take into account yung idea na yung adaptability ng ating armed forces. Ako, saludo ako sa Armed Forces of the Philippines, particularly yung 3 services. Kasi kapag bigyan mo sila ng gamit, they're willing to learn, train with them, adaptable sila. And heck, come on, kung titignan mo yung US Army, they have been so dependent on GPS. Alright? Pero hindi tayo reliant sa GPS kasi wala tayong GPS na pwedeng gamitin for our for across tactical and operational level. Pero we have been adaptable through map reading. Kung titingnan mo yung US Army basic training right now, Naka-rely na nga sila ngayon doon sa map reading. No? And gustong-gusto nila itong balikatan sa active army exercises for the reason that itong mga Filipinos know how to read the map. Kung titingnan mo kasi yung future scenario of a multi-domain warfare, ang argument ko dito, the first thing that will shut down is cyber. All right, which means yung information from the global positioning system, it will likely shut down. That's why we have to, it's most likely that our soldiers will rely, or all other soldiers would rely on maps to read. Sa akin, yung ability to read the map, may strategic effect siya, no? Of our combat power, no? Yung combat experience natin, we have been so adaptable. In other words, combat power, military power, not usually tinitira na a flaw of being a middle power. I would rather differ dito. I think doon muna, no? And at the same time, defense networks. For that reason, yung combat experience natin ay malakas. I would argue, in terms of combat experience, mas efficient tayo compared sa Singaporean armed forces. Right?
That's
so in other words, we're a middle power kung titignan mo ng maigi. So hindi to usapin ng half full, half empty na glass of water, but rather we are inviting everyone to take into the granularity of things. Of course, hindi tayo pwedeng mag-inflate ng mga indicators, but something na sanang tignan natin.
No, I mean, for me, Josh, I think, this is the classic type 1, type 2 error, diba? One type of error is thinking something's there, which is not there. The other error is thinking something's not there, which is there. And I think here it's like a false negative problem. I don't think the problem is overestimating the Philippines. I think the tendency is actually underestimating the Philippines. I remember there was this, usually my friends make Reddits about me to bash me. And one of the articles they bashed was, I had an article about the Philippines as a middle power, because my argument is very simple. Middle powers are known for three things, right? They're coalition builders, so they're good multilateralists, good citizens of the international community. Check tayo dyan. They have a certain degree of credibility, meaning they bring something positive to the table and can get the respect and of others. We have played that role in G7 and 7. We have played that role increasingly even with G7 countries. And lastly is certain level of strategic autonomy, right? Certain level of capability that gives you some, at least close to green water capability. And I would say in one way or another, we're ticking all the boxes, not 10 out of 10, but at least 6 or 7 out of 10. I would say pasado tayo in each of this criteria that is mentioned. Now, speaking of the what you were mentioning, which is very good, which is combat readiness. I remember this whole thing about Philippines beating the American F-22 with an FA-50 in a recent exercises. And a few years ago, sa electronic warfare, ASEAN-China war games, the Philippines came on top and everyone was shocked.
Exactly.
So when we're given forget about Ferraris, we're just given a, low-end BMW, we can beat the Lamborghinis. This is what we have proven over and over again. So it completely proves what you're saying.
So i-extend ko lang, no. Yung usual na argument kasi, pag may mga ganitong exchange ang mga militaries natin, usually ang framing is that humihingi tayo ng bagong gamit. Try to put it this way. Nandito sila because they want to learn from what we are doing. It's also transactional. We get the stuff and we should, and they get the training and they get the operational experience. Sana man lang tignan natin yon, lalo na sa mga friends nating mga quote-unquote think tanks.
Sir, if I may just add, it's a point.
Please go ahead.
Ni Joshua, I can confirm na part talaga ng training niya, kasi I underwent training this year, yung map reading, and it's a very big part of our military training. And yung not just in a classroom, of course may classroom instruction yun, but we have a field training exercise where we tried actually in the field, yung map reading.
I think I want to chip in on this.
Yes,
part,
go ahead, Justin, please.
Itong discussion on the middle power, siguro I want to reframe the discussion, because when we say you're a middle power, it's a broad category, right? Of basically every country that isn't a superpower but is of sizable importance.
It's a spectrum. It's a spectrum, yeah.
So it can range from countries like Japan, South Korea, etc., to something like the Philippines, which we all know they're very far apart from each other. So I think the conversation has to be reframed, right? So it's not just what you have, the power that you have, economic, political, military, etc. But it's about grand strategy. Grand strategy has three things, right? Ways, means, and ends. Means, what are the resources you have? Ways, how do you do that? How do you utilize those resources? But more importantly, what are the ends? What is the what is ano yung strategic goals, objectives of the country, right? Now, middle powers have very common objectives like to have a high GDP per capita for its population, to live comfortably, no, yung mga pamilya, to have a good population dividend, and so forth. But in the Philippine case, when you look at all our strategic documents, yung ambition natin, 2040, etc., the economic agenda of the Marcos administration, it's very, to be frank about it, it's very basic, no? Basic aspirational things. Now, kahit tanggalin mo yung Pilipinas from the name of the document, every country in the world wants to have that. So, if we're talking about national interest, I think dapat natin i-correct yun na we need to aspire for some things that are more concrete, no? So, for example, yung Singapore, yung strategy niya of attracting yung industrial manufacturing, no, in the 1960s, 70s from first world countries, and then it used that, and then eventually it moved yung supply chain building niya. Now Singapore is an advanced country that's more reliant on capital and technology, right? So yung sa Philippines kasi we don't really see that kind of forward-looking trajectory, the intention of the government. So I think, for example, West Philippine Sea issue, do we have a national commitment that in certain number of years, our goal is to push out China from the maritime zones, a majority of the maritime zones in the West Philippine Sea? And if we don't have it, why not? Because we keep on talking about middle power this, middle power economy, etc. But what's the objective here? Right? Kahit na maging middle power tayo, if China controls important sea lines of communication around our country, what on earth is being middle power for, right? So we have to relate being middle power with a clear set of objectives. That's what I'm talking about.
Kumbaga, Brother Justin, ang sinasabi natin dito is that middle power is just happened because we want to do something for ourselves.
Exactly. Middle power is about it's about power, but what is the purpose that you're going to use that power for? That's the more important thing. Because yung power it's what you have, right? Your means. But what is your aspiration? That's the thing we have to figure out.
Well, speaking of aspiration, I think geography explains a lot. We're smack right in the middle of the first and second island chain, both of which actually China wants to dominate, a little bit more successful in one than the other, right? And to make it even more interesting, we're next to Taiwan, right? Closer to Taipei than any major ASEAN capital. So my argument here is either you go middle power or you go home, right? Or maybe become a province of China. Do you get what I'm arguing? My argument here is we have no choice but to step up. So for almost a century, we have been under this illusion that we can just be under America's strategic umbrella and that will take care of everything. And we're not alone. The Japanese have had to deal with that. The Europeans, especially during the Ukraine war, woke up to that reality. The other one is our geography is our blessing. We're so far away from everyone. We're not going to be threatened. Well, guess what? That perhaps explains why we don't have a strong strategic culture because of complacency. But B, actually things are the opposite right now. Our maritime borders are very much the borders that superpowers want to dominate or preserve their dominance. So this is the time where we have no choice. You go up or you go home, right? In this case, go home to China, right? So I think that's the context within which I want to talk about it. Now, let's go to the next issue, grand strategy. Now, before we can talk about grand strategy, let's talk about some basic capability development. Now, gentlemen, all of you in one way or another work in the Philippines defense establishment. All of us have advised, the defense officials in different capacities. Josh, let me try start with the Navy ka. What's happening with the Philippine Navy? Because I think the unsung...
I once worked sa AFP, Joint Forces ako.
Joint Forces.
Force Manager.
My apologies for that. But my point is, of course, I mean, because I'm ang Philippine Navy sa AFP, right? Speaking of the Philippine Navy, I mean, the capital ships I saw were not too bad, and it looks like Korea is playing a very, very important role in our acquisition of modern warships. Practically all the modern warships I saw were Korean, except that one was semi-modern made in Indonesia. But I saw the map for 2028, what the Philippine Navy could look like in 2028, thanks to Korea coming in and helping us. But others are coming. The French are offering submarines. The Americans are offering all sorts of different advanced weaponries. What are we looking at? Are we looking at in the 5 years from now, very different? Like, the reason I'm saying is that, like, I remember when I was young, when you say BGC, it was like just Prince of Jaipur and Embassy Club, right? And then it was like parking lot. 10 years later, it's like a mini Dubai. So that made me realize, do not underestimate the Philippines. Sometimes in a decade, you can see a massive transformation of the country. And the Philippine Navy, compared to 10 years ago, I think has come a long way. And I'm optimistic in the next 5 years, it will still go a long way. Now, Philippine Coast Guard, we talked to some of our friends based in Japan. Their argument is that actually Philippine Coast Guard right now is arguably the best in Southeast Asia, at least in terms of in some dimensions, because of multi-role vessels and some of the improvements we made. So, in short, what I'm saying is that let's not get ahead of ourselves, but stop having this loser, self-deprecating mindset. A loser mindset is what we cannot afford. As I said, you go middle, at least, if not big, you go home otherwise, right? So please lang, let's get rid of this loser mindset. But is there a basis to get rid of the loser mindset, Josh?
Kung titingnan natin kasi dito, there's a big difference between a defeatist and a skeptic. No, kasi ang sa akin kasi dito, when you talk about defense planning, as part of the force manager once upon a time na researcher, is that ang problem ko kasi dito is that sa conventional wisdom natin is that when you talk about naval expansion, are we talking about a big flotilla of ships katulad ng Indonesia? If not the United States, of course. Of course, the answer is no. But how much is enough? As a fleet, no, na as part of the fleet, the future force structure ng armed forces of the Philippines. And this is something na napaka-difficult na tanong, kasi how much is enough? You have to keep asking yourself, but at the same time, the basic answer is just good enough. The question is, how good enough? Ang makakasagot lang nito ay yung political establishment. This is what I want because this is my end goal, sabi nga ni Justin. Okay, if that is the case, then sasabihin ng Philippine Navy as a force provider, this is what we want. But ang nangyayari sa atin, nag-send yung Philippine Navy natin, yung technical working team natin na ito po ang kailangan namin, future fleet, desired for, tawag dito, 2012, Philippine Fleet, desired fleet mix, yun ang tinatawag nila. Ang problema, oh no, that's a bit too expensive in terms of the capital outlay na expenditure natin. So ang gusto kong sabihin dito is that nung sinabi natin that we want this to happen, and then ito yung sinasabi ng military natin, then nabibigla ka. Teka lang, nag-i-step back ka na. Or you don't have any choice but to keep your economy performing so that you can put the force requirements at the table and realize it doon sa ground, or should I say in water and in the maritime domain, no? So yun yung kailangan natin makita. Ang hindi natin mawawala dito is that yung pag-conflate natin doon sa tinatawag nating skepticism of what we can really achieve versus wala na lang tayong gagawin. Right? So I'll leave it there.
Very good distinction. I mean, yeah, I mean, well, I would add also that what we can consider, I mean, your point of reference is actually China, right? That's the problem. What will be even the minimum depends. I mean, if China is building super warship every year, determine what's
ang sagot ko dito, it all boils down on force employment. Who is the threat and where will it be? Tayo muna magsabi, is China a threat? Kung sinasabi natin friends to all, enemies to none, that's not a good policy guidance for the defense sector. Okay, sabihin na natin, let's play it out. Paglaruan natin. Publicly, ikaw na naman, dyan ka na naman. So publicly, sabihin na natin, just to keep our people calm, no problem. Don't designate China as a threat. Pero behind closed doors, at least, dapat nagkakaintindihan tayo sino ba ang piniprepare natin. Kasi defense budget is a lot of money when you just to think about it. Kasi magkakaroon ng ripple effect yan sa training, sa doctrine, sa bibilihin natin. Ang daming trabaho niyan. So, political establishment to. China, is it a military threat? Yes or no? Skeptic ka ba na kakayanin mo and then just surrender? Ang problema, you are a republic. So therefore, you have no choice but to see China vis-a-vis your national interests.
But
So
Josh, I think the question of whether China is an external threat has more or less been established by our national security papers.
ang problema kasi natin dito is that the political establishment kasi, di ba, doesn't
Yeah.
want to make a public declaration eh. No?
Yeah.
So it brings slight confusion actually. Sabi nga ni Justin in the previous episode that I think the president has to be more bold in the policy guidance. Kasi yung hedging, for instance, it's a good IR term. I promise you, it's good for the people from the Department of Foreign Affairs. It's a good guidance. But for the national defense
I
people,
see what you're
it's
saying.
not.
Yeah. Okay, I want to add to this. I mean, and I want to get Miko's point of view and Justin on this. Obviously, it's about dealing with the Chinese threat. Okay, I think it takes a lot of, okay, I want to be nice about this. Medyo
Oops.
gabi na. Baka malusutan na naman tayo. Okay, whatever. It takes a lot of, acrobatics not to see that, right? Or maybe more than acrobatics. But the other thing is, I had this bunch of interviews and discussion with our American friends, Greg Pauling, a very good friend of mine from CSIS. One of the things we mentioned is that the Philippines cannot be an ally of, real estate tenant ally relationship. It has to be an ally that can also provide operational support to the United States. Like, I think at the very least, we have to be like, middle powers that can send, to, I don't know, near, Djibouti, right? Like for counter-piracy operation. If not Djibouti, at least, there in Malacca Strait. Do you get what I'm saying? It's also about not projection of power, but projection of responsible, contribution to international security. We want to be also that kind of ally, right? Gentlemen, Miko, maybe Justin first, and then we can go to Miko. Just right? I mean, it's also about that. That's why we need, hindi tayo hanggang pwedeng sobrang parochial lang. Strategic parochialism is our problem. We have to look at contributing actively to international peace and security beyond peacekeeping forces deployment.
Yeah, definitely. I think we do have. I think I have a more realistic take on this. No, why do we send out, for example, contingents of Filipino troops to UN peacekeeping missions? It goes back to the point that actually it contributes to your capability because you give combat experience sometimes to your troops. That's the bottom line. We had a Filipino contingent who stood in the Golan Heights. I think 2014, right? They stood up against pressure to capitulate militarily, but it gave them valuable experience which we can also use, because we have to understand that territorial defense doesn't happen overnight. So for example, if we're preparing for let's assume that if we're preparing for the contingency ng conflict with China, we're never going to have that experience until it happens, right? So what we can do is to try to send out our forces, give them more exposure, how to operate equipment, how to deal with hostile environments, and so forth. So that's the military value of that. So in that sense, hindi lang nga siya values-based foreign policy. It's actually a realistic foreign policy as well for us. I would like to point out though na on the subject ng capability build-up ng Philippines, yung biggest problem kasi natin ngayon is what we have patchwork modernization, meaning patche-patche tayo eh. Like 4 days ago, si Senator Bato de la Rosa said that the AFP modernization program from Horizon 1 to Horizon 3, based on data released by DND, is actually way underfunded. No, yung Horizon 3, the latest one, is only funded at 33% of the ideal budget request of DND for next year. So that in itself is a problem, right? And legislators need to realize that when you fund capability upgrades, hindi pwedeng magpa-prioritize ka lang ng certain something, because the modernization works as a concept, right? So for example, if we're modernizing the Philippine Navy, and they have, for example, what we call the fortress fleet strategy, meaning to say, aside from yung ships na pinoprocure natin, we're also going to buy coastal defense systems, yung mga missile systems. No, we recently procured one from India, right? All these things, they operate in tandem, because frankly, we cannot match China ship for ship, resource for resource. That's not an effective use of our resources, no? Mababangkarote tayo, right? And China has done that, for example, with Taiwan, na they intrude into Chinese airspace every day, to the point that Taiwan stopped responding to every incursion because it's a waste of jet fuel, for example. So it's a strategy of strategic exhaustion as well, for their part. So yung Philippine strategy is we need to have a more coherent and well-funded set of modernization. Then finally, I think what needs to be improved is what's the operating concept that we're leading to dito sa modernization na to, no? Because capability is also about how you employ that force. It's not just about what you have. And that's the problem we've had with China, no? Yung gray zone strategy that um yung rules of engagement ng AFP natin is not used to dealing with, for example, suspicious Chinese maritime vessel that is not allegedly tied to the PLA Navy, no? But you know, intelligence say that they really are connected. Yung maritime militia nila really is connected to that. So all these things have to work in tandem, no? The resource has to be there, the concept of how to use that resource has to be there. And I think that's the big problem that we have right now, because right now we still don't have a response, for example, how to deal with yung mga unsafe maneuvers by Chinese ships na kaya nagko-collide sila with the Philippine Coast Guard ships, for example. How do we deal with that, right? Do we make an explicit claim that, hey, if a collision at sea happens, we're going to call in the Mutual Defense Treaty with the US? We actually don't have even the basic guidelines. When are we going to activate Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty, right? We don't have it right now. So we need to think about the specifics of all these things.
Is there a template? I mean, I think the US Navy, was it back in 2019, kind of started treating Chinese militias as extension of the Chinese PLA Navy. So the rules of engagement got updated. President Marcos was in the Pentagon, got the, 18 gun salute, whatever. And one of the things they discussed inside the Pentagon was the guidelines of our mutual defense treaty and potentially dealing with cyber attacks and other kind of non-conventional or non-lethal kind of attacks. No, so it looks like we're looking in that direction, right? But I mean, do you have any template in mind in terms of dealing with gray zone strategies, so that China, because China now has the upper hand, they have the initiative. We're still scrambling on how to deal with them. Does Japan provide a template in how they deal in the Senkaku issue? Is there any country that is providing any template on how to deal with gray zone kind of harassment and bullying?
Right. Ako, ang basic approach ko to this is
anyone, no? Aside from Justin can also answer. I mean, this is the question for all of us.
Sure. Maybe Miko would like to deal with this.
Miko, you want to go? I mean, again, this is a discussion, so it doesn't have to be one person. Miko, you have an idea on gray zone?
Kasi Justin already started.
Sige. I'll just make a quick point about this. I think yung response to gray zone, at least for me, is response not to any specific incident, but just a general principle of policy. A policy statement, let's say you put it in a subsequent bilateral defense guideline, that if China purposely sinks a Philippine vessel, then that will make the Philippines activate the Mutual Defense Treaty. Kasi ngayon ambiguous yun eh. Are we going to call the Americans if we have an incident at sea that results in loss of life? We don't have a clear guideline on that. So we need to put it in writing. What's the rules of engagement with respect to the United States? And of course, what is our position, right? Because I understand some politicians here are not comfortable making a big issue out of West Philippine Sea incidents, right? Like during the Duterte administration, merong ramming incident, some Filipino fishermen were left stranded at sea. What was the political response of the administration? Is to downplay the incident. And to be frank, that's also a legal thing they could do. They can just play it off in the name of sustaining good relations with China. So we do have to settle first, how do we treat those incidents, especially yung mga military in nature, no? So before kasi fisher boats yung problem natin. Ngayon talaga, there is a real risk that, for example, China might sink one of the Coast Guard vessels or one of the commissioned vessels or the hired vessels we're doing para mag-resupply ng BRP Sierra Madre. And we need to make it public what that threshold is going to be. Kasi yung lack of threshold na yan, China is taking advantage of that.
Yeah, if I may add lang, sir, no. I think connected din to dun sa earlier discussion on AFP modernization. I think yung part of our response, or at least approach, no, to the gray zone issue here, is yung education and training din eh. Kasi it's a critical component of the modernization. Yeah, it's also very important to underscore na it's not just about as na-mention ni Justin kanina, yung we simply cannot match, no? Yung ship per ship and so on and so on. Yung education and training and even doctrine, it's a critical component of the modernization as well. We must remember, kasi it's not very familiar
to the general public, maybe as opposed to the police, no, and other civilian organizations. Yung sa AFP kasi, not everyone in the AFP are in the war fighting business. Meron tayong combat, there is combat support, there is logistics, and so on. It is, and yung different fields of specialization within the armed forces. When the military personnel, officers, and enlisted personnel talk to one another, doon mo makikita yung differences of opinion there. So what am I driving at here? It is crucially important na doon sa education and training of our soldiers, sailors, marines, airmen, yung pag-i-impart ng strategic mindset. Not just doong part nung of course important din yung mga tactical support, combat support, and so on. Those are important things, so get me wrong. But yung having that strategic mindset, lalo na when they occupy higher positions of command and responsibility, that is very important. Doon ngayon papasok yung importance what Prof. Richard was asking about earlier, yung importance of our engagement with other countries. And yung education ng ating officers, napakahalaga nun, lalo na in this evolving strategic environment in which we find ourselves in. Now, dun sa question ni Sir kanina on gray zone, again, you must remember na hindi lang sa South China Sea nangyayari yung gray zone na yun. It's yun nga, dyan papasok yung political influence operations, yung cyber. I think if I'm not mistaken, just this week, there's somehow a debate ngayon doon sa paggamit ng TikTok. NSC is saying one thing that we should ban it, if I'm not mistaken, and then another agency in our government saying we should study it further. So, kasi in other countries, if not mistaken, sa US ata, if you're a government official using a government phone, you're prohibited to have it in your phone. There are similar efforts na dapat daw gawin din natin yun dito. So what am I saying here? There should be a common understanding among the different government agencies. Kasi hindi na lang to DND eh. Yung political influence operations happens across different government agencies and in civil society then as well. How should we, yun nga, sinasabi whole of nation approach and so on. Ano ba yung understanding natin nun, nung gray zone na yun? Kasi sa others kasi, if you don't have that national security lens, you will see those economic and technological initiatives as something benign, or at the very least will not do any harm. But for us, that are looking things from a national security lens, it will cause alarm. Kasi it could have national security implications. So, yun nga, the key point here is the importance of education and training. Yes, of our officers and in the armed forces as well, but also yung sa different branches of our government and dun sa general public in general. Yan lang, sir. Thank you.
So, sorry, I think it will be good for Josh also to start with this. Okay, so should we look at a porcupine strategy for the Philippines, poison shrimp? Let's say it for what it is, right? Realistically, we cannot match China or even a lot of other countries in the region on a head-to-head basis. But I think we can reasonably go for a kind of a porcupine strategy if that's helping the Taiwanese so far. Why not the Philippines, which has way more population and resources to mobilize when things go south? Hopefully not.
Okay. Yes. Kasi I want to comment on this one. Perhaps this is a controversial statement, but my argument is this: not all solutions will be naval, right? When I say hindi naval ang sagot, kasi ang argument kasi the Philippine Army has to be reduced in its budget, give more money to Navy and Air Force. But the point is this: why? It's all about force employment. How are you going to empower unified commands to arrange an order of battle? At ang point dito is that you cannot fight ship to ship against the Chinese. There will be an argument. My prognosis will be there can hardly be a decisive Mahanyan battle na nakita natin sa Battle of Midway, Battle of Tsushima, or Battle of Jutland. There can hardly be such a thing for the Philippine case. So my point is this: you would understand bakit hindi pa rin natin sinusuko yung bulk of budget sa Philippine Army. No? you will understand that nag-activate na tayo ng territorial defense natin sa Philippine Army. They're transitioning for the very reason that you have to understand, perhaps not everything can be solved dito sa may tubig. Ang argument kasi, kailangan dalhin natin yung labanan away from our territory. But the point is this, you can't do that. You have to have a credible ISR capability. You need a good amount of logistics that could sustain that presence out there. Mahirap yon. Mahirapan tayo. You need a lot of money. I wish we could, but we can't. So, porcupine strategy is something that we can play out, but it has to be underscored for many factors. One for which is that I'm imagining the will to fight ng civilians alongside soldiers. Kasi most likely kapag nangyari na may labanan dito sa land, it's gonna be chaotic. Just imagine Metro Manila, papunta pa lang tayo sa work, hassle na. So imagine an urban warfare in Metro Manila. It's gonna be a problem. And that's gonna be a center of gravity para sa enemies natin, kasi ang magiging operational concept is that you have to capitulate the government, the Philippine government, once that happens. I think we should have learned what happened back in the Second World War. Yun ang nangyari when the Imperial Japanese forces came in, stormed in Central Luzon, northern to Central Luzon. Ang bilis lang kasi plains lang di ba? Yung plane lang yung from Lingayen, Pangasinan, papunta dito sa may Metro Manila. So hardly that we can imagine that Metro Manila is the center of everything. We have to understand that we have to empower operational level yung unified commands natin to defend the entire archipelago. And we have to make the enemy guess kung saan ang center of gravity natin.
Very
right?
good point.
So
Yeah,
yun.
very good point.
Inevitable na magkakaroon ng labanan dito. So we have to understand, Philippine Army will still have a good amount of budget aside from the Navy and Air Force. Kailangan joint forces
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I think earlier this year, there was a massive army exercises done sa Fort Magsaysay, right? And they were employing Ukraine-style, war tactics, which tells you we are preparing for a potential invasion of Luzon, should things go ugly. And I think in Balikatan, we also had the kind of a flavor of that. So Josh, okay, you're saying it shouldn't be Philippine Navy only, but given how historically there has been overemphasis on land warfare capability because of internal insurgency, don't you think that you need a certain level of Navy first kind of mindset para lang maayos natin, ma-offset natin itong historical imbalances? You get what I'm saying? There's a value to exaggerating the role of Philippine Navy.
Yeah.
Even
So I think ang argument ko dito, this is where you have to understand your limits. Ang prognosis ko kasi dito is that limited talaga ang sea power natin. I don't think that in an event of an open conflict, the order of battle will be that we would have a good amount of principal combat surface capabilities, let alone 2 pieces of submarines in the order of battle. Come on, let's not kid ourselves here. So perhaps if you want to have an advantage over sea, perhaps you can leverage on naval mines. Pero maraming usapin on environmental catastrophe, of course. So sa akin, pasensyahan na sa mga tropa natin dito. Pero I'm just being realistic here na may hirapan tayo. Even if we, achieve yung desired fleet force mix natin sa 2028, it's still not enough. That is why operational level commands, unified commands, has to be empowered on how to be creative. Let not the president nor the Secretary of National Defense decide on what kind of tactics they should employ. Let NOLCOM, let Westcom do this, and trust that they will do this in the interest of the Republic. So may level of civil-military relations dynamic dito.
Josh, let me push back against that a little bit. Again, this is for the sake of discussion. Well, we live in an era of A2AD. We live in an era of asymmetric capabilities. We live in an era of anti-cruise missile capability. We live in an era of swarming strategies. We see, for instance, Iran deploying that quite effectively in the Persian Gulf, right? They're facing the most powerful navy in the world, but they can pose a counter threat should things get ugly. I mean, my point here is that the invention of drones, or the drone warfare we saw in Azerbaijan, Armenia, in Ukraine, Russia. My sense is I completely agree with you that that idea of set piece battle in the high seas. Yeah, forget about that. But Philippine Navy having a lot of drones, anti-cruise capability,
Yeah.
things China is doing to the US right now, or Iran is doing to the US.
Yeah.
I think we can go down that
Yeah.
road too,
Yeah.
right? Against
Yeah,
China.
exactly. So
The Vietnamese are doing
yeah,
that.
I think in principle, Richard, I agree with you in that idea kasi an ideal force structure, sabi ng Australian General si Mick Ryan in his book, na an ideal force structure should be a combination of fire and forget autonomous weapon systems, and at the same time ito mga flashy, expensive na mga man capabilities natin. Kasi ang sa akin kasi parang ang nangyayari kasi dito is that parang ang sinasabi mo kasi dito, Richard, is that there's a scenario whereby we're all on this alone. Indeed, I think we have a unilateral defense plan, as tweeted ni Justin, na hindi pinag-uusapan, no? There's another scenario then that we have to consider that the United States will be there. So sa akin kasi, perhaps the reason I mentioned that is that I'm assuming that I'm letting the United States Navy, 7th Fleet handle the high seas battle and according to our national interests, protect our own sea lanes and increase our command and control capabilities with the Americans so that they can control the rest of the high sea concerns and let our territorial archipelagic security intact. So yun yung aking assumption on this one. Yeah, but yeah, drones, swarming tactics is a good way to cover large enough coastlines na kailangan natin compensate.
Yeah. Justin, you want to talk about that lonely fight scenario apocalypse? Yeah.
I think before I get to that question, yung porcupine strategy kasi meron ding internal debate yan with itself, right? Do you acquire yung mga mention nga ni Joshua, flashy, cost investment heavy equipment, or yung what they call a large number of small things, which is the Ukrainian strategy, right? And I would actually argue that hindi siya 100% applicable to the Philippine case because we don't have land battles in the immediate area that's going to be attacked by China in a contingency. So you're talking of naval battles there, which are essentially capital intensive heavy battles. So you're talking about corvettes, you're talking about your surface fleet, ranged fires, yung mga missile system, air defenses, and so forth. Yung mga bagay na yun, these things we need to invest on. So we cannot have modernization on the cheap, no? Hindi tayo pwede magtipid dito talaga. And to begin with, any self-respecting country should have missile defense systems to begin with. So the idea that, the AFP is being a drain on the resources of the country is actually should be put into perspective. It's not even 3% of our GDP, which is more in line with our regional neighbors, no? So that's one thing. In terms of yung point on a scenario wherein we do have to fight unilaterally, no? The AFP calls that the unilateral defense plan. And there is actually that contingency na let's assume that the United States doesn't come to the aid of the Philippines. We should be prepared for that. And it's not something, ang spin kasi dyan, the United States is an unreliable ally and so forth. But any self-respecting country should be able to defend its national territory on its own, right? And we should have that capability. And the problem is those advocating for a position na we need to be friends with China, they're also not advocating for beefing up the capabilities of our military. So I would be perfectly fine with it if they advocate na yes, you should have a large navy, yes, you should use that navy to counter China's growing expansion. But the problem is, ginagawa nilang bundle na to make peace with China, you have to sort of neuter your military. You have to, you have to...
Appeasement.
Yeah,
self-mutilation. Medyo ang hinahanap.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good term for it, self-mutilation. So, in that sense, yung porcupine strategy natin should be, frankly speaking, maximizing the costs for China. It's really A to AD, it's area and access denial for China.
Yeah.
That's really what it is, it's to make sure that even if we can't meet them ship for ship in, let's say, the West Philippine Sea, we do have capabilities to neutralize them, such as yung mga shore-based missile batteries and so forth, which we are actually procuring right now. So we are heading in the right direction. It's a question of whether we do have the funding for it. That's That's it from a capability standpoint.
Fantastic. We're already approaching 3 hours of conversation. I can see na the drain tayo. I still had many questions. I have notes here and all. I want to talk about the Goldilocks alliance with the United States. I want to talk about the whole thing. In fact, the grand strategy, balikan natin. But maybe we can wrap up the episode here because sumusoko na yung mga followers natin. Although, I mean, some of our followers were even pointed out yung exercise actually was Cope Thunder exercise. I think sinasabi ko na, yung natalo natin ng F-22, di ba? So you can see, people watching us know a thing or two. So I'm very glad na natutuwan tao sa discussion natin, almost 3 hours. Maybe just some final points to wrap up this episode. So I don't know, Poison Shrimp meets A2AD meets Porcupine. What are we looking at here? Miko, maybe I'll start with you before I go to Josh and Justin for closing remarks for this really fascinating episode. We're already talking about apocalyptic scenarios, but this is what I don't think economics is the real grim science. Ours is the grimmest of sciences, right? War studies and international affairs. Go ahead, Miko.
Yeah, this has been a very fascinating conversation. I mean, the inputs and the perspectives that User and Justin and Joshua has raised are really very interesting and indeed very helpful for the defense planners. What I'll say though is this briefly. And I'll jump off where Justin has left off. No? The important thing, I guess, here is that coming from a military background is always prepare for the worst case scenarios. Of course, we could hope for the best, but preparing for what could happen in the future, yung worst case scenarios, what will happen if the US will not come to our assistance. These are all very important areas in which our planners should be also focusing on. No, I will not go into the details as an active officer. I am talking to my superiors, but what I'll say though is this, yung importance, it is also important to highlight na in the last two administrations, yung defense planning is going a bit more institutionalized as opposed to before. To be fair to the middle level managers of our defense establishment and the armed forces, talagang may effort naman talaga na to institutionalize defense planning. And to be fair, I mentioned this in the previous episodes na yung Duterte administration, for all of the noise that we have heard, no, I mean, in the 6 years that it was in power, it is very important also to underscore na yung Duterte administration had, I think, yung very sequential planning. It started with an NSP and it for the first time in our history nagkaroon ng NSS, and we had an NDS. Tapos ito hindi ito masyadong napag-uusapan sa public. We had a national military strategy then under the Duterte administration. Although, just a footnote here, we also had a national military strategy in the Aquino administration, but the problem was we did not have an NSS and an NDS during that time. So what I'm driving at here is that while there is still work to be done, yung ginagawa ng mga middle level managers in our defense establishment to institutionalize all of this planning, there is what we call, I mean, Justin knows this coming from the planning office of the DND, yung defense system of management. Talagang this is a product of the JTA assessment during the Arroyo administration. Now, to be fair, it's been 2003 ata yun, if I'm not mistaken. It's now 2023. Ini-institutionalize pa rin yun hanggang ngayon. So, again, to give credit to dun sa mga individuals or bureaucrats who the public may not know or may never know. May not be as popular or as prominent as other officials, but they are doing the efforts na may not be fully appreciated by the public. So I'll stop there, sir.
Thank you, thank you. So they may not be as popular as Robin Hood and but when they're doing their job. Okay, just to spice it up. Josh, the last points.
Well, ang pag pinag-uusapan kasi natin itong AFP modernization, no, magastos talaga siya. Inevitable sa isang republic na mag-spend. Actually, hindi nga siya an expenditure. I love my undergrad economics professor. Sabi niya, these things are not expenses. These are investments. Diba? So, national defense is an investment for a purpose. Ang tanong, bakit natin gagawin to? It's a good thing to say na poprotektahan natin ang territorial integrity, sovereignty. Pero it's also a question, for what purpose? What do you want? Diba? So every time we talk about these strategies, please understand, mga kababayan, na hindi tayo nagsusow ng war dito. Pinag-uusapan natin dito is that if dumating yung mga scenarios na ayaw natin, while at the same time, may mga gusto tayong gawin sa buhay, what are we gonna do about it? And what are we willing to sacrifice? It's better to invest now, no? I sound like a financial planner na nagbebenta ng policy. Pero usapin kasi ito ng ating what we hold dear as a republic. As I mentioned in the previous episode, bata pa ang republika. Bata pa lang tayo, mangarap na tayo, no? Ang mga pangarap natin dapat it has to be backed up with capabilities. Hindi tayo nagde-daydreaming. Itigil na natin ang huwan tamad principle na sana ang kapayapaan at kaunlaran ay darating na lamang. As much as we want that we want to have a serene na waters for our fishers to have, others have a vote. Hindi porke ito yung gusto mong version of future mangyayari yon. A future will always be contested. The question will be, what kind of future do you want? That is why we lay out these planning, scenarios, wargaming, discussions, bardagulan, marketplace of ideas. It's because we all want the same thing. That is Philippine interest to be upheld for a young republic such as ours. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Josh. And Justin, last points?
Yeah, last point for me, ito, prepare ko to. Before we had this discussion, I thought, what do I want to impart to the readers? And for me, it's very simple. We've talked about the technical side of defense planning, but I wanted my point to be on the political rationale. Bakit nga ba natin ginagawa lahat ito, no? And for me, it's a simple fact that contrary to the rhetoric we're hearing out there, we are not being dragged into conflict. We ourselves already are in conflict. Deny it as much as we want, no? Whether or not nandito yung United States, we will have tensions with China, no? Look no further than the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident, no? Bakit nga ba nagsimula itong whole history of our tensions with China? The Philippine Navy and Coast Guard tried to interdict illegal Chinese fishers in our exclusive economic zone, which China tried to deny, right? So in short, it is trying to deny a sovereign function of the Philippine government. So hindi natin mawi-wish away yung mga tensions na to, eh. So we need to prepare for them, no? So that's really why we're doing what we are doing, no? All these tensions, nagsimula yan just between us and China. The US is an addition to that story because the Philippines tried to, bring them in, and up to today we're still doing that. But when you look at how this story began, it's between us and China, and that's the important takeaway that we have to focus on here. So I like to end with a quote, no, if you stand for nothing, you fall for anything. And I think that's what's important here. We need to be clear about what is it we're standing up for, what's the floor, what's the ceiling of our defense policy, why we're doing what we're doing, and how do we respond to these threats to territorial integrity. No? It's also a respect not just to ourselves, but to previous generations of Filipinos and also to those yet to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Parang politikong speech yun, but that was really good. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. I can see a lot of excitement, support. There's, believe me or not, there's still some people following us. Almost 3 hours of conversation. If it were not for Friday traffic and a long day and my colds and all, I'm sure I don't mind doing Joe Rogan for 5 hours even. But just that tells you, that tells you how much more there is to discuss. I'm already thinking about next episode on Philippine-US alliance, how to make it the best possible alliance. I'm already thinking about Philippines and the middle powers like Japan and India. I'm already thinking about how to get it right with China. So the discussions are so enriched that it nanganganak sila ng mga topics already at the back of my mind, no? So thank you so much for sharing your voice. Thank you so much also for everyone supporting us. Thankfully, I mean, some people made kind contributions online and all, which we'll use for the editing and just setting this up. So I really, really appreciate it. And looking forward to more of this, gentlemen. Thank you very much, Miko Galang, Justin Bakisal, and Joshua Espena. And looking forward also to be joined by other folks in the future as we discuss the Philippines foreign policy and defense policy in the 21st century. Maraming salamat. God bless and have a happy weekend, gentlemen. Thank you.